When Mia discovers that her manipulative in-laws have secretly drained her and her husband Ethan's savings, stealing over $15,000, including their house deposit, she's devastated. But when she learns that Ethan also gave them access to his personal savings, totaling over $55,000, her heartbreak turns to fury. Determined to take control and get justice, Mia hatches a bold plan. She buys the very house her in-laws are renting, becoming their landlord and flipping the power dynamic. What starts as a battle of wills soon unravels into something far darker when Mia digs into her in-laws' finances and uncovers a shocking secret. Diane and Robert haven't just been irresponsible, they've been running a fraudulent scheme, using fake business loans and siphoning money from family to cover their tracks. With their lies exposed and Mia tightening the noose as their landlord, the once dominant in-laws spiral into desperation. In a scandalous twist, their criminal actions catch up to them, and Mia finds herself turning over evidence to authorities, ensuring they face justice not just from her but from the law itself. This is a gripping story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimate redemption, proving that when you cross the wrong person, karma comes back tenfold. Ethan and I had been married for just over 6 months when I first got the call from his mom, Diane. It was one of those calls you don't see coming, the kind that leaves you wondering how you ended up with someone else's problems sitting squarely in your lap. Diane sounded frantic, her words spilling over each other as she explained that they were in a tight spot financially. "Mia, sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine, "Robert and I are in a bit of a bind. We've had some unexpected medical expenses, and we just need a little help to get through the month." I glanced over at Ethan, who was sitting next to me on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He gave me a reassuring smile and nodded, as though to say, "It's okay. You can trust them." "How much are you short?" I asked hesitantly. "Oh, it's just a couple thousand. Maybe 5. But we'll pay you back as soon as we're on our feet again. You know how it is, these things happen." I didn't know how it was. My parents had always been careful with money, teaching me to save for emergencies and live within my means. But Diane and Robert seemed to be in perpetual crisis mode. Still, they were Ethan's parents, and Ethan was my husband. We were supposed to be a team, right? "I think we can swing it," I replied, my stomach tightening as I said the words. $5,000 wasn't nothing to us. It was a decent chunk of our savings, money we'd been putting away for a down payment on a house. But Ethan squeezed my hand, and I reminded myself that family helps family. "That's what you do." I transferred the money that same night, ignoring the nagging feeling in the back of my mind that something about this didn't sit right. Diane thanked me profusely, and Ethan kissed me on the forehead, telling me how lucky he was to have such a kind, generous wife. For a little while, I felt good about what I'd done. I told myself I was being the bigger person, doing something selfless. But it didn't stop there. A month later, Diane called again. This time it was something about their car insurance. If they didn't pay it, their policy would lapse, and they wouldn't be able to drive. It was just a couple hundred this time, she promised. Ethan was standing right next to me when she asked, nodding like it was no big deal. Reluctantly, I transferred the money, brushing aside the growing knot in my stomach. The calls became more frequent after that. There was always some new emergency. Their electricity was about to be shut off, they needed groceries, Robert's medication was too expensive. Each time, Diane sounded apologetic but hopeful, as though she expected us to swoop in and save the day. And each time, Ethan urged me to say yes. "They've had a rough couple of years," he said one night as we sat down to review our budget. "They'll get back on their feet soon. It's not like they're asking for millions." "Ethan, we've given them almost $10,000 in less than 3 months, I pointed out, my voice tight with frustration. "This is our savings. How are we supposed to buy a house if we keep bailing them out?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's a lot, babe. But they're my parents. What am I supposed to do? Let them sink?" I wanted to scream that it wasn't our responsibility to fix their poor decisions, but I held my tongue. Ethan was a good man, too good, maybe. He had a soft spot for his parents, and they knew it. They had him wrapped around their little finger, and I was starting to feel like a third wheel in my own marriage. I started cutting back on our own expenses to make up for the money we were losing. No more dinners out, no weekend getaways, no splurging on things we didn't absolutely need. Ethan noticed, of course, but he didn't say much. I think he felt guilty, though he'd never admit it. Then, one day, everything came crashing down. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was at home on my lunch break when I decided to check our bank account. I'd been keeping a closer eye on our finances lately, paranoid that we might be in worse shape than I realized. But nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Our savings account, the one we'd been building for years, was nearly empty. Over $15,000 had been withdrawn in a single transaction, leaving just a few $100s behind. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the transaction history, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then I saw it, the money had been transferred directly to Diane and Robert. I sat there, staring at the screen, my hands trembling. This wasn't just another favor. This was theft. There was no way they'd taken that kind of money without Ethan's help. I called him immediately, my voice shaking with anger. Ethan, what the hell is going on? Where's our savings? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mia, I can explain. Then start explaining, I snapped. Because $15,000 doesn't just disappear. Did you give it to your parents? He hesitated, and I felt like I might explode. They needed it, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Their house was at risk. They promised they'd pay us back as soon as possible. Are you kidding me? I shouted, my vision blurring with tears. You gave them our house deposit, Ethan. Without even telling me. Do you realize how hard we've worked for that money? They're my parents, he said defensively. I couldn't just let them lose their home. But it's okay to put our future on hold for them. To jeopardize everything we've been working toward. I could hear the guilt in his voice, but it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made me angrier. He'd chosen them over me, over us. I hung up on him and called Diane, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She picked up on the first ring, her voice sickeningly cheerful. Mia, dear. How are you? Cut the crap, Diane, I snapped. Where's our money? She didn't even try to deny it. Oh, that. Well, Ethan said it was okay. You know, family takes care of each other. It's just money, dear, you'll make more. My jaw dropped. It's not just money. That was our future. You stole from us. Don't be so dramatic, she said with a chuckle. We'll pay it back eventually. You'll see. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She didn't even sound sorry. In that moment, I realized just how little respect Diane and Robert had for me, or for Ethan, for that matter. They saw us as a bank, not as family. And I was done playing their game. Something inside me shifted that day. I wasn't just angry, I was determined. If they thought they could take advantage of me, they were in for a rude awakening. I didn't know exactly how I was going to get back at them, but one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let this slide. Not this time. The days after discovering what Ethan and his parents had done were a blur of anger, resentment, and an overwhelming need for clarity. I was furious, not just with Diane and Robert but with Ethan, too. He had betrayed my trust, putting their needs above our marriage without so much as a conversation. Every time I replayed Diane's smug voice in my head, telling me it was just money, my blood boiled. But anger alone wasn't going to fix this. I needed a plan. I needed to regain control, not just of our finances, but of my life. The first step was separating my money from Ethan's. I stayed up late that night, poring over bank statements and our joint accounts. My hands shook as I drained what little was left into a new account I'd opened in my name only. I didn't tell Ethan about it, at least, not yet. I wasn't trying to be sneaky, I was trying to protect myself. If he was so willing to let his parents run our finances into the ground, I couldn't afford to give him access to mine anymore. The next day, I went to work like nothing had happened, but my mind was spinning. I worked as a real estate agent, and luckily, business had been good lately. I had 3 commissions coming in over the next month, enough to rebuild a small emergency fund if I tightened my budget. But that wasn't enough. I needed to think bigger. Diane and Robert were living in a rental property not far from where Ethan and I lived. It was a modest house, nothing fancy, but it was in a desirable neighborhood. Over the years, I'd heard them complain about their landlord raising the rent or neglecting repairs. They were always on the verge of being evicted, though they somehow managed to scrape by. Knowing what I knew now, I suspected they were probably late on rent more often than not. That's when the idea hit me: if I couldn't trust them to return my money, maybe I could find a way to leverage their dependence on us. The thought was petty at first, pure revenge fantasy, but the more I considered it, the more it made sense. Diane and Robert had used us as their financial safety net for months. What if I flipped the script? What if I became the one holding the cards? That night, I waited for Ethan to fall asleep before logging into my computer and doing some research. I pulled up the county property records and typed in Diane and Robert's address. Sure enough, the house was owned by an older gentleman named Mr. Whitaker. A little digging revealed that Mr. Whitaker was in his late 70s and had owned the property for decades. Judging by the low property taxes and the lack of any recent permits, it didn't seem like he was doing much to update the house. I took a deep breath and decided to take a chance. The next morning, I called Mr. Whitaker. "Hello." His voice was scratchy but friendly. "Hi, Mr. Whitaker. My name is Mia, and I'm a local real estate agent. I was wondering if you've ever considered selling your property at Diane and Robert's address." There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. "Well, I've thought about it," he admitted finally. "The tenants there are nice enough, but they're always late on rent, and the house needs more work than I can keep up with." "Why do you ask?" "I'd be very interested in buying it," I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. "I could make you a cash offer, no contingencies. We'd close quickly, and you wouldn't have to deal with the hassle of listing it on the market." "Cash, you say?" he asked, suddenly sounding more interested. "Yes, sir. I've been looking for investment properties in the area, and your home fits what I'm looking for perfectly." We talked for another 10 minutes, and by the end of the call, I had a meeting scheduled with Mr. Whitaker to discuss the sale. I hung up and sat there, staring at my phone. I was doing it. I was actually doing it. If everything went smoothly, I would own the house Diane and Robert were living in within a few weeks. Of course, this plan wasn't without risks. Buying the property would eat up most of my savings, and there was always the chance they wouldn't pay their rent or would refuse to move out. But I couldn't ignore the thrill of taking control, of turning the tables on the people who'd taken so much from me. When Ethan got home that evening, I was unusually quiet. I was still angry with him, though I hadn't decided how, or if, I wanted to confront him again. He must have noticed the tension because, after dinner, he sat down across from me and said, "Mia, I know you're still upset. And you have every right to be. I just want you to know that I'm going to talk to my parents about the money. I'll make sure they pay us back." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "And what makes you think they'll actually pay us back this time?" He flinched, but to his credit, he didn't argue. "I don't know. I hate seeing you like this. I know I screwed up." For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. I knew Ethan's heart was in the right place, even if his actions weren't. But guilt wasn't enough to fix the mess we were in. I need to take care of this myself, Ethan, I said finally. I can't rely on you to handle it. He looked hurt but didn't protest. I think he knew better than to push me right now. Over the next few days, I finalized the deal with Mr. Whitaker. True to his word, he was eager to sell, and I managed to negotiate a price that left me with just enough cash to cover closing costs and some initial repairs. It was a tight squeeze, but I wasn't worried. Owning that house wasn't just about the money, it was about the power. On the day of closing, I drove to the title company, signed the paperwork, and walked out with a set of keys in my hand. The house was mine. Diane and Robert didn't know it yet, but their lives were about to change. That evening, I called Ethan into the living room and handed him the keys. "What's this?" he asked, frowning in confusion. "It's the key to your parents' house," I said, unable to hide the smirk spreading across my face. "I just bought it." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You what?" "You heard me. I'm their new landlord." Ethan looked like he might pass out. "Mia, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I replied, crossing my arms. "Your parents have taken enough from us. It's time for them to learn a lesson." He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he slumped onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. "I don't even know what to say." "Then don't say anything," I said, my voice cold. "Just stay out of my way. I'm handling this now." Ethan didn't argue. For the first time, I felt like I was in control, not just of our finances, but of my marriage. And as I sat there, holding the keys to Diane and Robert's house, I knew I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The morning after I became Diane and Robert's landlord, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to figure out my next move. The idea of confronting them outright was tempting, but it wasn't enough. I didn't just want to shock them, I wanted to make them squirm. I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd done and feel the consequences of their actions. I spent the day drafting a formal letter as their new landlord. It wasn't an eviction notice, yet, but it laid out the rules of the game. The letter informed them that I was the new owner of the property and that, moving forward, all rent payments would be made directly to me. I also included a clause stating that any missed or late payments would incur strict penalties, and if they were late more than twice, I'd begin the eviction process. The best part? I included a revised lease agreement, at market rate. Diane and Robert had been paying below market rent for years, thanks to their previous landlord's generosity. That was over. The rent increase wasn't outrageous, but it was enough to make them uncomfortable. I wanted to hit them where it hurt, their wallets. Once I had everything ready, I printed out the letter and drove over to their house. My heart was racing as I pulled into the driveway. I couldn't decide if I was more nervous or excited. Part of me was bracing for the inevitable blow-up, but another part of me couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, Diane answered. Her face lit up when she saw me, like she thought I was there to bring them more money. It made my stomach turn. "Mia. What a surprise." Come in," she chirped, stepping aside to let me in. I walked into the living room, where Robert was sitting on the couch, watching TV. He glanced up and gave me a half-hearted smile, clearly uninterested in whatever I had to say. "I'm not staying long," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I just came to drop this off." I handed Diane the envelope containing the letter and new lease agreement. She frowned as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. The color drained from her face as she read. What is this?" she stammered, looking up at me. "That's a notice informing you that I'm your new landlord," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I bought the house from Mr. Whitaker. From now on, all rent payments will go through me." Robert muted the TV and sat up straighter, his brow furrowed. "You bought the house. Why the hell would you do that?" Because I can, I said simply, meeting his glare. And because I'm tired of being taken advantage of. Diane looked back at the letter, her hands trembling. You raised the rent. Mia, you can't do this. We can barely afford what we're paying now. That's not my problem, I replied coolly. You've been living here on borrowed time and borrowed money. Consider this a wake-up call. If you want to stay, you'll need to pay the new rate, and on time. This is ridiculous, Robert snapped, standing up. We're family. How can you do this to us? I crossed my arms, my gaze steady. Family doesn't steal $15,000 and then act like it's no big deal. You took our house deposit, Robert. You stole our future. So forgive me if I'm not feeling particularly generous. Diane's lip quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But instead of apologizing, she lashed out. You're being petty, Mia. We told you we'd pay you back. Do you really think this is going to solve anything? Oh, I think it's going to solve a lot, I said, my voice icy. You've had no problem taking money from me and Ethan whenever it suited you. Now, you can pay it back, starting with rent. And if you can't handle that, you're welcome to find somewhere else to live. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. I've already filed the new lease with the county, so it's official. You have 30 days to sign it. If you don't, I'll begin the eviction process. You wouldn't, Robert growled, his face red with anger. Try me, I shot back, my eyes locked on his. This isn't a game anymore. You wanted to treat me like a doormat? Fine. But now I'm the one in control. And believe me, you're going to regret underestimating me. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the muted television. Diane and Robert looked stunned, like they couldn't believe what was happening. I took one last look at them, then turned on my heel and walked out the door. As I drove away, a wave of adrenaline coursed through me. I'd never felt so powerful, so in control. For months, they had manipulated Ethan and me, draining our finances and treating us like their personal ATM. But not anymore. This was my house now, and they would play by my rules, or they'd be out on the street. Over the next few weeks, I made a point of documenting everything. I kept meticulous records of every communication with Diane and Robert, every payment, or lack thereof, and every interaction I had with them. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. If they tried to pull something, I wanted to be ready. At first, they didn't take me seriously. Diane called Ethan multiple times, crying and begging him to talk some sense into me. Ethan, to his credit, stood his ground. I think he was still reeling from the fact that I'd bought their house, but he didn't try to stop me. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that I was handling the situation. But Diane and Robert weren't done pushing back. When the first rent payment under the new agreement was due, they didn't pay. Instead, Diane called me, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Mia, dear, we're having some trouble coming up with the rent this month. Could you give us a little more time? Just until next month? No, I said flatly. The terms of the lease are clear. Rent is due on the 1st, no exceptions. But Mia. I'm not your daughter, Diane. I'm your landlord. If you don't pay, you'll receive a formal notice of non-payment, and if it happens again, I'll begin the eviction process. Her tone changed instantly. You're being unreasonable. We're family. And you stole from family, I snapped. You don't get to play the victim here, Diane. Either pay your rent, or start packing. She hung up on me, and I knew the war had officially begun. A few days later, I delivered the notice of non-payment to their door. Diane refused to answer, but I could see her peeking through the curtains as I taped the notice to the door. I almost laughed at how quickly the tables had turned. For the first time, they were the ones feeling powerless. And I wasn't done yet. By the time the second month rolled around, they had scraped together enough to pay their rent, barely. It wasn't lost on me that they'd had no trouble taking money from me before, but when the roles were reversed, they suddenly found a way to make ends meet. It only proved what I'd suspected all along: they weren't helpless. They were just entitled. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I wanted them to feel the full weight of their actions, to understand that their choices had consequences. So, I decided to take things a step further. I called a contractor and arranged for a full inspection of the property. I wasn't looking to renovate, I wanted to find every little issue with the house and make sure Diane and Robert were held accountable for any damage they'd caused. When the report came back, it was worse than I'd expected. The house was in disrepair: leaky pipes, damaged walls, a broken furnace. Some of it was wear and tear, but a lot of it was negligence. I sent them another letter, outlining the repairs they were responsible for as tenants. If they didn't address the issues within 30 days, I'd hire someone to do it, and charge them for the cost. When Diane called to scream at me, I didn't even flinch. Her outrage rolled off me like water off a duck's back. Every insult, every guilt trip, every plea for sympathy, it all fell on deaf ears. I wasn't the same Mia they'd manipulated before. I was stronger now, colder. And I wasn't backing down. By the end of the second month, I had them exactly where I wanted them, paying rent on time, following the rules, and finally understanding that I wasn't someone they could push around. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The third month of being Diane and Robert's landlord started quietly, almost suspiciously so. They had grudgingly paid their rent on time, and I'd received no hysterical calls or passive-aggressive texts from Diane. The silence was unnerving, like the calm before a storm. My gut told me they were up to something, and it wasn't long before I found out I was right. One Friday morning, I received an email from my property management software. It was a notice about a tenant-initiated inspection request, something I hadn't authorized or even expected. Apparently, Diane and Robert had called the city, claiming the house had serious safety violations. The email stated that a city inspector would be visiting the property that afternoon to assess the claims. I clenched my teeth as I reread the email, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. Diane and Robert were trying to weaponize the system against me. They must have thought that if the house failed the inspection, they could argue for reduced rent, or even find a way to get out of their lease entirely. They were desperate, clearly, but this was a new low, even for them. Determined to get ahead of their scheme, I immediately called the contractor who had inspected the property earlier. His report had confirmed that the house was structurally sound, and I was confident he'd back me up if the city inspector had questions. Still, I decided to show up for the inspection myself, just to be safe. When I arrived at the property later that afternoon, Diane and Robert were standing on the porch, looking smug. Diane greeted the inspector with her best concerned mother act, gesturing wildly toward the house and rattling off a list of supposed hazards. The roof is caving in, the plumbing's a disaster, the wiring could set the place on fire. She sounded like she was auditioning for a soap opera. I stood silently to the side, letting her dig her own grave. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, nodded politely but didn't seem particularly impressed by Diane's theatrics. As Carla began her walk-through of the property, I trailed behind, keeping my distance but taking mental notes. Diane and Robert had clearly staged the house to look worse than it actually was. They'd left faucets dripping, deliberately overstuffed outlets with plugs to make the wiring look unsafe, and even placed buckets under the sink as if there was a major leak. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Their attempts to sabotage me were as pathetic as they were transparent. By the time Carla finished her inspection, her expression was stone cold. Diane hovered nervously, clearly expecting some kind of grand declaration in her favor. Instead, Carla turned to her and said, "The house is structurally sound. There are no major violations. Any minor maintenance issues are standard for a rental property of this age." Diane's face fell. "But, the plumbing. The outlets. Tenants are responsible for reporting minor issues like dripping faucets or overloaded outlets to the landlord for repair, Carla said sharply. I suggest you familiarize yourself with your lease agreement. I couldn't resist a smile as Carla handed me the official report. Diane was fuming, her face red with embarrassment, but Robert's expression caught my attention. He wasn't just angry, he looked defeated. And that's when I realized something was off. Diane's schemes had always been brazen and shameless, but Robert had never looked like this before. It wasn't just the failure of their plan that had him rattled. There was something else going on. I didn't have to wait long to find out what. That evening, Ethan came home looking pale and distracted. He'd been avoiding conversations about his parents ever since I'd bought the house, but now he seemed almost panicked. I barely had a chance to ask him what was wrong before he blurted it out. They're filing for bankruptcy. I froze. What? My parents, he said, running a hand through his hair. They're broke. Like, completely broke. They can't pay their credit cards, their medical bills, nothing. And they didn't want to tell me, but I overheard them talking about it. My stomach turned. On one hand, it wasn't exactly surprising. Diane and Robert had been living way beyond their means for years. But on the other hand, it complicated everything. If they declared bankruptcy, there was a chance they'd stop paying rent altogether, and I'd be forced to evict them. Part of me wanted to celebrate the idea of finally kicking them out, but another part of me felt uneasy. Something didn't add up. Why didn't they tell you? I asked. Ethan hesitated. Because, he trailed off, avoiding my gaze. Ethan, what aren't you telling me? I pressed. He sighed heavily, sitting down at the kitchen table. Because they didn't just drain our savings. They drained my personal savings too. The account I had before we got married. It's gone. My jaw dropped. How much, Ethan? He looked away, shame written all over his face. 40,000. The air left my lungs. $40,000. On top of the 15,000 they'd already stolen from our joint savings. That was over $55,000, more money than most people made in a year. My mind raced, trying to piece together how they could possibly justify taking so much from their own son. And then, like a lightning bolt, it hit me. They're hiding something, I said slowly. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? I mean no one blows through $55,000 in a year just to cover rent and groceries. Not even them. There's something else going on, something they're not telling you. Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but deep down, I could see that he agreed. Diane and Robert weren't just bad with money, they were pathological liars. If there was a secret to uncover, I was going to find it. That weekend, I decided to do some digging. Using the property records I'd already accessed when I bought their house, I searched for any other assets Diane and Robert might own. At first, nothing turned up. No additional homes, no cars, no boats. But then I noticed a strange financial lien under Diane's name, something tied to a business loan. A business loan? Diane didn't have a job, let alone a business. Curious, I dug deeper, cross-referencing the loan with public records. That's when I found it, a failed LLC Diane had started 3 years ago. The business name? DNR Consulting. My heart sank. It wasn't a consulting firm at all, it was a front. With a sickening feeling, I realized what had happened. Diane and Robert had been running a fake business to scam money out of banks and credit card companies. The loan they'd taken out had been massive, easily 6 figures. But when the scheme fell apart, they hadn't declared bankruptcy to erase the debt. Instead, they'd siphoned money from Ethan and me to cover their tracks. I printed out everything I'd found and confronted Ethan that night. At first, he refused to believe it. They're not criminals, he insisted. They're just bad with money. Ethan, I said, shoving the documents toward him. This isn't bad with money. This is fraud. They lied to you, stole from us, and used your money to fund their scheme. And when it all went to hell, they left us holding the bag. For the first time, I saw something shift in Ethan. He wasn't just hurt, he was angry. Really, truly angry. He finally understood what I'd been trying to tell him all along. Diane and Robert didn't see us as family. They saw us as a safety net, a way to cover their mistakes without taking responsibility. I'm done, he said quietly. I'm done with them. The next day, I filed an official eviction notice. Diane and Robert tried to fight it, of course, but the law was on my side. By the end of the month, they were out of the house and scrambling to find somewhere else to live. Ethan cut contact with them completely, blocking their numbers and refusing to take their calls. But the biggest twist came a few weeks later, when I got a call from a detective. Apparently, Diane and Robert's fraudulent business practices had finally caught up with them. The bank had flagged their fake LLC for suspicious activity, triggering a criminal investigation. When the detective asked if I had any information, I didn't hesitate to hand over everything I'd found. A few months later, Diane and Robert were arrested for fraud and tax evasion. It was all over the local news, suburban couple caught in financial scam, and I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. They had spent years lying, stealing, and manipulating everyone around them, and now they were finally paying the price. Ethan and I are still rebuilding, both financially and emotionally, but we're stronger now. We've learned to set boundaries and put each other first. And as for Diane and Robert, the last I heard, they were living in a cramped apartment, trying to scrape by on what little they had left. It's funny, really. They thought they could take everything from me, but in the end, I took everything from them. Sometimes, justice has a way of coming full circle.